He built empires, closed billion-dollar deals until that morning. A little girl in worn sneakers walked into his marble lobby, holding a paper bag of coins. "Where can I buy a dad?" she asked. He froze. For the first time, he didn't feel powerful. He just felt lost and deeply, painfully human. Before we begin, if this kind of story speaks to your heart, feel free to share where you're watching from. It's always beautiful to see how far stories like this can travel. The morning chill outside didn't faze Jackson Cole. Dressed in his signature pale blue suit and Italian loafers, he walked through the towering glass doors of Cole Enterprises like he owned more than just the building. He owned the air itself. Every step clicked with precision against the marble lobby floor. He was a man known for never being late, never being surprised, and certainly never being unprepared. At 43, Jackson had spent the last 2 decades building one of the most formidable real estate empires in Chicago. People called him ruthless, precise, untouchable. He liked it that way. His assistant, Maddie, waited near the elevator with his tablet in hand, the day's agenda pulled up and highlighted. She gave a polite nod as he approached, expecting him to take the device and continue his seamless glide into another high-stakes day. But he stopped. His gaze had locked on something, or rather, someone. Near the reception desk, sitting cross-legged on the polished floor as if it were the most natural thing in the world, was a little girl. She couldn't have been older than 6. Her white dress, wrinkled at the edges, peeked out beneath an oversized denim jacket that swallowed her small frame. She hugged a sparkly purple backpack close to her chest, its straps frayed and worn. Her shoes, light-up sneakers that had long stopped lighting, were scuffed from use. But none of that struck Jackson the way her face did. She had big, unblinking eyes the exact shade of his own, a piercing, stormy blue, eyes that didn't cry, didn't tremble, just watched, like she was waiting. The lobby staff glanced nervously toward him, unsure whether to alert security or pretend they didn't see her. No one said a word, no one moved, except Jackson. Something in his chest tightened, a sensation he hadn't felt in years, not during deals, not during setbacks. This was something else. He walked slowly toward her, crouched down, awkwardly, like a man unused to being at eye level with a child, and cleared his throat. "Hey there," he said, voice softer than he expected. "Are you lost?" The girl blinked once, then tilted her head slightly. "No," she said plainly. Jackson tried again. "Where's your mom? Does she work here?" She shook her head. "No, but you do, right?" "I do," he replied, confused. "Good." She reached into the front pouch of her backpack and pulled out a crumpled paper bag that jingled faintly with coins. Then she looked him straight in the eye and asked with absolute clarity, "Where can I buy a dad?" The air changed. A few people within earshot froze. Maddie's grip on the tablet tightened. Jackson couldn't move, couldn't speak. "I've been saving," the girl added matter-of-factly. "Mostly quarters, some dimes. If you don't cost too much, I think I can afford you." Jackson blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" She took a deep breath, clearly annoyed by his lack of understanding. "I need a dad. I asked a lady at the bus stop, and she said maybe a rich man could help. So I came here." Still kneeling, Jackson stared at her. A dozen thoughts started through his mind, each more frantic than the last. Was this a prank? A publicity stunt? Some sort of scam? Then she dropped the last line, and it hit like a punch to the gut. "If you're going to be my dad," she said calmly, "you have to help Mommy. She's really sick. And we don't have any money." Silence spread across the lobby like a wave. The receptionist looked away. Maddie's lips parted, but no words came. Jackson inhaled slowly. Somewhere deep in his core, something fractured. Not from logic, not from strategy, from instinct. From the place inside him that hadn't been touched in years. He looked at her more closely now. The backpack, the jacket, the hunger barely hidden behind those serious eyes. "What's your name?" he asked. "Daisy," she said. "Daisy Meyer." Meyer. The name clawed at something buried. Jackson stood, slowly, the name spinning in his head. Then he reached down and offered his hand. I don't know what this is yet, Daisy, he said carefully, but let's go help your mom. She didn't smile. She just nodded like it was the most natural response in the world and placed her small hand in his. Maddie took a step forward. Sir, your 9 a.m. with Larkstone Development. Cancel it, Jackson said without looking back. He didn't glance at his phone. He didn't ask for his coat. He just walked with Daisy out the front doors of the building, hand in hand, into the cold morning air. His driver, Thomas, blinked in surprise as Jackson opened the door himself and helped the girl into the back seat. Briar Street, Daisy said, rattling off an address that made Thomas raise his brow slightly. Sir? Drive, Jackson replied, and don't ask questions. The black sedan pulled away from the towering glass building behind them. For the first time in years, Jackson Cole didn't care who was watching. The drive across town felt longer than it was. Jackson sat beside Daisy in the back seat, unsure whether to look at her or out the window. She held onto his index finger like it was a handle on a subway car firm. Steady, as if she expected him to lead the way, even though she was the one who had walked into his life, uninvited and completely unshaken. He found himself watching her in quick glances. The way she stared out the window with the seriousness of someone much older, the way her feet dangled above the floor without reaching it, the way her backpack jostled every time the car turned. She didn't ask questions. She didn't offer details. She just sat there, humming softly to herself, perfectly calm. That unsettled Jackson more than anything. He hadn't been to Briar Street in over 20 years. Back when it was mostly blue-collar families, cramped corner stores, and old red brick apartment buildings. Now, it was a patchwork of fading murals, crooked street signs, and buildings that leaned with time. As they crossed into the neighborhood, something shifted in him. A memory, maybe. The cracked sidewalks, rusted fire escapes, the sight of a once familiar grocery store still somehow in business. He hadn't thought about this place in decades, and yet it was all coming back. Thomas slowed the car and glanced at him in the mirror. "We're here, sir." Jackson looked out. The building was older than he expected, a squat two-story structure with chipped paint, rusted balcony railings, and a sagging green awning that barely clung to the front door. Daisy climbed out first and pointed to the stairs. "We're up there, second floor." He followed her, heart thudding strangely in his chest. The narrow hallway smelled faintly of damp carpet and stale cooking oil. Daisy pulled a key from the tiny inner pocket of her backpack and slipped it into the door with practiced ease. The moment the door creaked open, Jackson froze. The room was dim, but not dirty. Clean, actually. Sparse. A tiny couch pushed against the far wall, its cushions visibly slouched from age. A small kitchen with a few stacked dishes drying by the sink. Toys, a few, not many, lined the baseboard in neat rows. And there, on a thin mattress near the only window, lay a woman. She stirred at the noise, her head lifting slightly. Her face was pale, her cheeks hollowed, but the moment she turned and looked at him, Jackson felt the air leave his lungs. "Rachel." She blinked, eyes wide and disbelieving. "Jackson?" It wasn't a question of identity. It was a question of reality. He stepped inside slowly, stunned. The last time he had seen her was 12 years ago, just before he accepted a project in New York. They had been something close to serious, something fragile and promising. And then he left. He'd always told himself it was for business, growth, vision. But sitting here, watching her struggling to sit upright on a futon, he couldn't remember a single deal that ever felt as real as this moment. She coughed lightly into a tissue, then tucked it under the pillow. Her voice was thin, but steady. What are you doing here?" Jackson looked down at Daisy, who was now rummaging through a plastic bin for a blanket. "She found me," he said, "at my office, this morning." Rachel's eyes filled with something unreadable. She nodded once, slowly, like she'd expected this day for a long time, and feared it all the same. Of course she did. Jackson stepped closer. The apartment was warmer than he'd imagined. Not in temperature, but in soul. Worn, yes, but lived in. Daisy laid the blanket beside her mom and climbed up to sit cross-legged beside her. "I told him," she said softly, "that if he's going to be my dad, he has to help you first." Rachel's lips curved just slightly. "She's always been like that. Brave when it matters." Jackson's hands were in fists at his sides. Why didn't you tell me? Rachel took a long breath. You left. You changed your number. You went to London after New York. By the time I found out I was pregnant, I didn't even know how to reach you, and I was angry, hurt, then scared. He sat in the old chair next to her makeshift bed, the legs squeaking beneath his weight. You thought I wouldn't care. She didn't answer, but her eyes did. Daisy, sensing the shift, walked into the kitchen and pulled a juice box from the fridge. Want one? She asked him casually, holding it up like a peace offering. Jackson blinked. Sure. She brought it to him and returned to her spot beside Rachel, curling up next to her without another word. It was in that moment that Jackson finally understood the gravity of what he was seeing. Not just a woman sick in bed, not just a child sitting on the floor of a small apartment, but his family. He stood suddenly, pacing the room. How long have you been sick? Rachel exhaled. About a year. It started with fatigue, then headaches. By the time they did a scan, the tumor was already pressing on my optic nerve. I've been in and out of the hospital. I do what I can with the little I've got. And you didn't ask for help? She glanced at him with a quiet fierceness. You think it's easy asking the man who disappeared from your life to come save it? Jackson flinched. That's fair. She softened. I didn't want to complicate your life. You were always chasing something bigger. I figured I'd just be the thing that slowed you down. He looked at Daisy again. She was now drawing with a half-broken crayon on the back of a grocery receipt. She's mine, he said, not asking. Rachel nodded. Jackson rubbed his hands together. Okay, he said, more to himself than anyone else. Okay, Rachel looked up, wary. What are you doing? He crossed to her bedside and knelt beside her. You're coming with me, both of you. Her brow furrowed. Jackson, you need treatment, real treatment, not patchwork ER visits and home remedies. You need specialists. You need rest. And Daisy? He looked at the little girl who had somehow changed everything in a matter of hours. She'll have her own room, her own bed, everything she needs, and so will you. Rachel's throat tightened. Why now? He met her gaze, steady and certain. Because I should have been here the whole time, and because I'm not about to let my daughter lose her mother. For a long moment, Rachel said nothing. Then she nodded. All right, she whispered. Let's go home. Jackson didn't wait. He helped her to her feet gently, careful of every movement. She was light, too light, but she didn't resist. As they made their way down the stairs, Daisy skipped ahead, humming quietly. She didn't fully grasp the shift in her world, not yet, but she felt it. Even Jackson could tell. He glanced once more at the apartment door behind them. Faded paint, a sticky doorknob, a whole life squeezed into a two-room box. Then he stepped into the car, his arm still around Rachel's shoulder. Where to, sir? Thomas asked. Jackson looked out the window, then down at Daisy, whose head had leaned softly against his side. Home, he said again. Take us home. The sun had started to dip behind the horizon by the time Jackson's car pulled up the winding drive to his lakeside estate. Tall pines framed the road, and beyond the final bend, the house emerged like a monument modern, sprawling and painfully silent. Designed by an award-winning architect, the estate had floor-to-ceiling windows, clean angles, and carefully curated spaces that had never seen a fingerprint out of place. It was beautiful, untouched, empty. Jackson had never brought anyone here, not really. Colleagues visited his city office. Business partners met him at high-end restaurants or hotels. This house? It was for solitude, for disappearing. Now, it was for them. Thomas parked the car at the side entrance. Jackson stepped out first and opened the door for Rachel, who was half asleep from the drive, her body still recovering from the exhaustion that never seemed to leave. Daisy followed, clutching her backpack tightly. She didn't ask questions, just looked, slowly, curiously. As they stepped into the house, the air changed. The foyer smelled faintly of lemon polish and cedar. The hardwood floors gleamed. The furniture was sleek, untouched. Daisy's sneakers squeaked softly as she stepped onto the tile. She looked around, the vaulted ceilings, the fireplace built into the stone wall, the staircase curving gently toward the second floor, and blinked slowly. She didn't gasp or squeal. She just absorbed. "This is your house?" she asked. Jackson nodded. She tilted her head. "It feels quiet." He swallowed. "Yeah, it always has." He led them to the guest suite on the first floor. He'd had Maria, his longtime housekeeper, prepare the room earlier that afternoon. Fresh linens, soft pillows, even a small nightlight he found in storage. He had no idea if Daisy used one, but it felt like something a child might need. Rachel sat down on the edge of the bed, breathing heavily, her hands trembling as she steadied herself. Jackson kneeled in front of her, concern etched across his usually stoic face. "You're okay," he said softly. "You're safe now." She looked at him with something between gratitude and disbelief. "I haven't slept in a bed this soft in years." "You'll sleep here as long as you need," he said. "Doctors are coming tomorrow, private care, specialists." Her expression tensed. "Jackson, I know, you're not used to help, but let me do this." Daisy dropped her backpack on the floor and climbed onto the bed next to her mom, curling up beside her like it was second nature. Rachel smiled weakly, running a hand through her daughter's hair. "Is this really happening?" she asked quietly. Jackson looked around the room, a room that had never held a single memory until now, and nodded. "Yeah, it is." That night, Jackson didn't return to his office. He didn't check his emails or answer the dozen missed calls Maddie had surely made. He sat in his study, staring at the fireplace that had only ever been lit once before, during a power outage. Now it glowed with a soft amber flame. Across the hallway, through the security monitors, he could see Daisy asleep, curled into a tight ball, one arm wrapped around her mother's waist. Rachel was still awake, her gaze turned to the ceiling, lost in thought, or fear, or hope. He didn't know what had changed in him, but he knew it had, and he didn't want to go back. The next morning, Jackson tried to make breakfast. It was a disaster. He burned the eggs, dropped a glass, spilled orange juice on his tailored shirt. But when he finally set a plate of uneven toast and scrambled eggs, half browned, half runny, in front of Daisy, she beamed like it was a royal feast. "This is awesome," she said, mouth full. "Mom never lets me have toast this crunchy." Rachel sat nearby, sipping water slowly, her color just a shade better than the day before. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I owe you more than breakfast," Jackson replied. Rachel shook her head. "You don't owe me anything." Jackson paused. "That's not true." There was a long silence. Then Daisy perked up and asked, "Do rich people eat eggs too?" Jackson blinked. Yeah, not these ones usually, but yes." She giggled. "Good. I thought I had to learn how to like caviar." That made Rachel laugh. Really laugh. She doubled over, coughing slightly but smiling through it. Jackson watched her, stunned. He hadn't heard that sound in over a decade. Not since those quiet mornings in their small apartment, back when she used to hum while tying her hair in the mirror. Later that afternoon, the doctors arrived. Jackson had arranged everything: blood tests, scans, a care coordinator. They worked swiftly and gently. Rachel never had to sign a single form. "Stage 2, one of them explained. "There's reason to hope, with the right care. It'll take time and effort, but she's not alone anymore." Jackson nodded. "Whatever she needs, she gets." By the end of the day, Rachel was back in bed, exhausted but grateful. Daisy lay beside her again, her stuffed bunny, missing one ear, tucked between them. Jackson stood in the doorway, watching them. "Do you want me to leave the door open?" he asked. Rachel looked up. "Yes, just a crack." He nodded and stepped back. The door clicked softly behind him. That evening, he sat by the fire again, this time with Rachel across from him, wrapped in a blanket, a cup of tea in her hand. "I didn't know if I should tell her who you were," she admitted, her voice low. "She always asked about her dad. I said he lived far away." "She found me anyway," Jackson said. "And she walked into my life like she owned it." "She's like you in that way," Rachel whispered, quiet when it matters, bold when it counts." He nodded. "I missed so much." We both did. The fire crackled between them. The silence wasn't heavy. It was tentative, gentle, the beginning of something that neither of them knew how to name just yet. The house, once a cavern of solitude, now echoed with footsteps too small to notice and laughter that hadn't been heard in years. Daisy changed everything. Rachel changed everything. And for the first time, Jackson Cole began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, the house hadn't been waiting for a renovation. It had been waiting for a family. The days that followed moved in gentle rhythms, slower than Jackson Cole was used to, but not unwelcome. Morning light streamed through the tall windows of his estate, catching dust motes in its golden net as if time itself had slowed down to make space for this new life. Rachel's color began to return. Her appetite slowly picked up, and with each passing day, she regained a little more of the woman he remembered and a lot more of the woman he was just beginning to know again. Daisy thrived instantly. Her world expanded from 2 rooms and a cracked sidewalk to gardens, open space, and the delight of discovering that bathtubs could have bubbles just for fun. Jackson made a point to be there. He rearranged meetings, turned down boardroom lunches, and traded his usual pressed suits for sweaters and rolled-up sleeves. More than once, Maria the housekeeper caught him attempting grilled cheese or folding laundry. She said nothing, but the quiet approval in her glance said volumes. But one part of the house remained untouched. At the end of the west hall, behind a thick oak door, was a room that never opened. The doorknob was smooth from years of avoidance. No one was told what was behind it. No one was allowed in, not even Daisy. "Why is that room always locked?" she asked one afternoon as they played dominoes in the sunroom. Jackson didn't look up from his piece. "It's just storage." Storage doesn't need to be locked," she replied matter-of-factly, balancing a domino on its edge. He didn't answer. Daisy squinted at him. "Is it a treasure room?" He smiled faintly. "Not exactly." She didn't press again, not then, but her curiosity lingered in the way children's questions do, alive and patient beneath the surface. That night, Jackson found a note slipped under the locked door, folded twice, written in crayon. He opened it carefully. It was a drawing. 3 stick figures, 2 big, 1 small, under a yellow sun. At the bottom were 5 words, spelled a little crooked. "For your baby, from me." Jackson stared at the drawing for a long time. His hand gripped the paper tighter than he meant to, the corners crinkling beneath his thumb. He could feel something rising in his throat, but he swallowed it down. He returned to his study that night and poured a drink he didn't touch. He stared at the fireplace until the flames turned to embers. Rachel joined him after Daisy had gone to bed. She wore one of the cozy sweaters he'd left folded on the foot of her bed and moved quietly, her presence softer than silence itself. "You okay?" she asked gently. He didn't answer at first. Then he reached into his pocket and unfolded the drawing. "She left this." Rachel looked at it, smiled, then looked at him. "What's in the room, Jackson?" He took a breath, then another. It was going to be a nursery. Rachel's face softened with understanding, but she didn't speak. "I built it when I was engaged. Years ago. We lost the baby. A boy. His name would have been Liam." He exhaled slowly, the words tasting foreign after being buried so long. "After the funeral, I locked the door and never opened it again." Rachel sat across from him, her hands folded loosely in her lap. "That's why the house feels like it's waiting for something." Jackson glanced at her. "You think so?" "I do." Later that night, after Rachel had gone to bed and the house had settled into stillness, Jackson stood alone outside the locked room. The paper Daisy had drawn was still in his hand. The hallway light buzzed faintly above him. He reached for the key. His fingers trembled. He hadn't touched the lock in 5 years. The key slid in smoothly, and with a quiet click, the door creaked open. Dust swirled in the air as the light from the hall spilled inside. Everything was just as he'd left it. The blue walls with hand-painted constellations, the white crib with a tiny blanket still folded neatly, shelves lined with unopened books, unopened toys, and one rocking chair tucked into the corner, frozen in place like a relic. Jackson stepped in slowly. The air smelled like wood polish and faint memory. He ran his hand over the edge of the crib. There was no crying, no laughter, just the silence of something that never got to begin. He sat in the rocking chair and looked around. He could still hear echoes from that year baby name debates, paint swatches, the ultrasound photo he used to keep in his wallet, and the day he stopped being that version of himself. He didn't know how long he sat there, just breathing in the space, letting the pain rise and fall. Then he stood and walked to the shelf. Among the untouched books was a small wooden train set. He picked up one of the cars, held it for a moment, then carefully carried it out. The next morning, he gave it to Daisy. "It's old," he said, "but it's yours if you want it." She didn't ask where it came from. She just smiled and said, "Thank you, Daddy." The word landed like a shot to the chest. It was the first time she'd said it without hesitation, without prompting. He swallowed the knot in his throat and nodded. "You're welcome, sweetheart." Later that day, Jackson entered the room again, this time with Maria behind him. He gave instructions: clean it, freshen it up, but don't change too much. Not yet. That night, over dinner, Rachel looked at him differently, not with sympathy or awe, but with recognition, as if she'd seen the man he used to be rise up through the cracks of the man he'd become. "You opened the room," she said softly. "I did," he replied. She reached across the table and squeezed his hand once, nothing more, nothing less. And for the first time, Jackson felt that the past wasn't a weight he had to carry alone anymore. It was part of his story, their story, a chapter that was painful, yes, but no longer sealed shut. Because healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about finally opening the door. By mid-November, the trees around the estate had turned a fiery gold, their leaves spinning through the air like little messengers of change. The lake behind the house reflected the sky in calm ripples, and for the first time in his adult life, Jackson Cole felt like he was living inside a moment, rather than racing ahead of it. But even as the warmth inside the house grew, through shared meals, soft laughter, and quiet evenings, Rachel's eyes began scanning for exits. She tried to hide it, but Jackson noticed. It started with her browsing apartment listings on her phone late at night. Then came the quiet call he overheard while walking past the kitchen, her inquiring about low-income housing not far from the hospital. She didn't mention it to him, not directly, but he saw the way she folded up the pages and tucked them in a drawer, like a secret too heavy to carry, but too painful to let go of. He waited a few days before bringing it up. "You're planning to leave?" he asked one morning, coffee in hand, watching Daisy chase a squirrel across the backyard through the glass. Rachel looked up from the table, startled, then quickly composed herself. "I'm not planning anything. Just preparing." Jackson turned slowly to face her. "Why?" She exhaled. "Because this isn't our house. It's yours, and I'm not someone who overstays their welcome." He leaned against the counter, silent for a long moment. "You're not overstaying." "I'm also not your responsibility," she said, her voice soft but steady. "You've been kind, more than I ever expected, but—" "Stop," he cut in, gentle but firm. "I don't want you to go, not because you need me, because I need you." Rachel blinked. The words had come too fast, too real. She lowered her eyes. "I don't know if this is something temporary or something real." He stepped forward, knelt beside her chair, and took her hand. "It's real. For me." Before she could answer, a knock echoed from the hallway. It was Daisy, holding something in both hands, a clay sculpture from school, lopsided and wobbly. "It's our house," she said proudly. "I made it today. That's the porch, and that's the tree, and that's the room with the stars." Rachel took the sculpture with trembling fingers. Jackson leaned back and smiled. "Looks just like it." Daisy beamed, then skipped off, humming to herself. That night, after Daisy fell asleep, Jackson found himself staring out the window of the nursery, the one that had stayed locked for 5 years, but now glowed with string lights and children's books stacked on a shelf. He had started keeping it open during the day, letting Daisy come and go, letting her curiosity slowly fill the air that had once held only grief. Sometimes she sat in the rocking chair and read to her bunny. Sometimes she just laid on the floor and drew pictures of the stars on scrap paper. Jackson never interrupted. He just watched. The next morning, while walking back from the guest suite, he heard Daisy call from the hallway. "Dad!" He stopped cold. She was waving a drawing in the air. "You forgot your good luck hug." He dropped his briefcase and scooped her up without hesitation. "I didn't forget," he said, smiling. "I was just testing you." She giggled and wrapped her arms around his neck, and for a moment, Jackson forgot that he'd ever lived a life without that sound. Rachel watched from the archway, one hand pressed lightly to her chest. Something inside her, some wall, began to give. Later that week, Jackson came home early from a quick downtown meeting and found Rachel in the sunroom, pen in hand, writing in a small journal. She didn't hear him at first. Her expression was peaceful, focused, her hair tucked behind one ear. When she finally looked up, she said, "I've started writing again." He smiled. "I remember when that was your dream." "It still is," she said. "I just forgot." He walked over and took a seat beside her. "Then let's make sure you don't forget again." The days passed. Daisy began calling him Dad more often, without flinching, without formality. Jackson responded each time with the kind of tenderness that once would have embarrassed him. Now, it grounded him. Maria started leaving dinner plates out for 3 without asking. Jackson's assistant Maddie stopped putting evening calls on his schedule. His colleagues learned not to expect him on weekends. Something had changed, and everyone around him could feel it. But not everything was easy. One cold afternoon, Rachel found Daisy staring out the window, her face unusually serious. "What's on your mind?" Rachel asked, sitting beside her. Daisy whispered, "Do you think he'll stay?" Rachel's heart squeezed. "He's here, isn't he?" "Yeah," Daisy said, "but I mean, forever." Rachel kissed her forehead and held her close. "Let's give him the chance to answer that." That evening, Jackson stood in front of the fireplace, watching the flames. He didn't hear Rachel come in behind him, but he knew she was there. "I saw the listings," he said. "I know. I also saw the sketchpad on the nightstand, and the way Daisy looks at you both, like she's finally allowed to believe something good won't get taken away." Rachel stepped beside him. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Not of you. Of getting used to something I'll lose." He looked at her fully. "Then let's not lose it." Her eyes welled. "You say that now, but I've never been more certain of anything." He took her hand, slowly, carefully, and held it like a vow. They didn't kiss, didn't say anything more. But in that moment, with the fire reflecting in the glass, something permanent passed between them. Not guests, not visitors, not temporary, something real. Winter arrived with quiet grace, painting the edges of Jackson's estate with frost and turning the lake behind the house into a frozen mirror. Inside, the warmth wasn't just from the fireplace. It came from laughter during breakfast, from Daisy's footsteps racing down the hall, from the steady, patient rebuilding of a life that had once been so carefully walled off. One crisp Saturday morning, Jackson received an invitation, a thick cream envelope embossed in silver foil. It was from the Downtown Renewal Fund, a nonprofit he'd once donated to through his company. Inside was a formal request. Would he consider being the keynote speaker at their winter charity gala? He stared at the card longer than expected. Rachel looked up from the couch, where she was editing one of her essays. "Are you going?" "I haven't decided." She raised an eyebrow. "That doesn't sound like you." Jackson folded the invitation and set it aside. "It's different now. I'm different now." That week, Rachel encouraged him. "If you speak, maybe talk about something real, not quarterly earnings or urban development plans." "Like what?" he asked. Rachel's eyes softened. "Start with the little girl who walked into your office and asked if she could buy a dad." The words settled in his chest like a stone, but not a heavy one. More like something solid, something true. When Jackson arrived at the gala, the venue was already buzzing with polished laughter and clinking glasses. He wore a simple suit, no tie. A decision that seemed small, but felt symbolic. He didn't come as the Jackson Cole people expected. He came as the man he was trying to become. The MC welcomed him warmly, introducing him with the standard accolades: real estate mogul, philanthropist, industry visionary. Jackson walked to the stage, took the microphone, and for a brief moment, just stood there, scanning the room of sharp suits and designer gowns. Then he began. "Several weeks ago," he said, "a little girl walked into my office. She didn't cry. She didn't ask for candy or toys. She asked where she could buy a dad." The room went still. She had a backpack full of coins and eyes that didn't flinch. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't admitted to myself in years, that everything I'd built meant nothing if it couldn't answer that question. People leaned in. Phones were put away. The air thickened with emotion. She asked me to help her mom, who was sick, and in doing that, she helped me remember what mattered, helped me stop running, helped me become the kind of man who might actually deserve to be called Dad. He didn't use a script, didn't need one. The story spilled from him, honest and uncluttered. I'm not here tonight to talk about financial forecasts or land acquisitions. I'm here to tell you that second chances don't always come with fanfare. Sometimes they arrive in tiny voices and worn-out sneakers. And if you're lucky enough to be given one, don't walk away. He ended with a nod and stepped down into the silence before the applause started, soft at first, then building into something that felt more like respect than celebration. When he got home that night, the house was quiet. Rachel had stayed behind with Daisy, who was curled up on the couch, fast asleep with a storybook clutched to her chest. Rachel met him at the door, barefoot, wrapped in a cardigan. "Well?" she asked. He set his coat aside and stepped toward her. "I told them the truth." She smiled, proud and quiet. They stood there for a beat too long, the air between them humming with something unspoken. Then Rachel said softly, "Do you still want us when it's no longer urgent? When we're not the ones who need rescuing?" Jackson reached into his coat pocket. He didn't speak. He simply opened a small velvet box. Inside was a ring, simple, elegant, nothing flashy, just like her. Rachel stared at it, her breath catching. "I don't want to be the man who came into your life for a season," he said. "I want to be the man who never leaves again." She didn't answer with words. She stepped forward, wrapped her arms around him, and whispered into his chest, "Then don't." They stayed like that for a long time, quiet, unmoving, the house holding its breath around them. In the other room, Daisy stirred slightly, unaware that the question she asked weeks ago had just become the beginning of forever. Later, after she was tucked into bed and the lights were dimmed, Jackson placed the ring box on the kitchen counter beside Rachel's writing journal. The two items sat there side by side, commitment and story, truth and promise. And for the first time since he built this house, Jackson realized it wasn't the walls or the furniture that made it a home. It was the people inside. The morning after the gala, snow dusted the trees outside the house like powdered sugar. The lake had frozen completely, and Daisy, bundled in mismatched mittens and a puffy red coat, stood at the window announcing, "If the ducks had sweaters, they wouldn't look so cold." Jackson smiled as he poured coffee into two mugs, one for himself, one for Rachel, who had just stepped into the kitchen with sleepy eyes and a sparkly ring on her left hand. She didn't wear it like a trophy. She wore it like a secret one she wasn't hiding, but wasn't flaunting either. Just something real, solid, earned. "Good morning, fiancé," Jackson said with a grin, handing her the mug. Rachel rolled her eyes but smiled into the steam. "Don't get used to saying that like it's a coupon you get to use whenever you want pancakes." "I'll trade you pancakes for a lifetime." She nudged his arm gently, laughing. Corny, but charming. Across the table, Daisy sat working diligently on a drawing. When Rachel leaned over to look, she saw a picture of three stick figures holding hands again, only this time there was a heart above the parents and a speech bubble from Daisy's mouth that read, "We're getting married." "We are," Rachel whispered. That afternoon, Jackson called Maddie, his assistant, and told her to move all his meetings 2 weeks out. "Everything?" she asked, stunned. "Everything," he confirmed. "Should I start panicking?" "No, just start believing I have a life now." Maddie paused, then said softly, "About time." From that point forward, life inside the house settled into a rhythm not dictated by obligation, but by love. Jackson took over morning duties. Breakfast wasn't perfect, but Daisy loved it anyway, especially when he burned toast and made faces at the smoke alarm. They started walking her to school, hand in hand, Rachel's scarf wrapped loosely around her neck, and Jackson carrying Daisy's glittery backpack like it was a Louis Vuitton briefcase. Evenings were their favorite time. They read stories on the couch, often with Daisy falling asleep mid-sentence, and Rachel dozing off with her. Jackson would carry Daisy to bed and pause by the nightlight as she muttered sleepy things like, "Don't forget to be my dad tomorrow." He always whispered, "Never," and kissed her forehead. Weekends brought simple pleasures. Building snowmen that looked more like snow potatoes, baking cookies that somehow always stuck to the pan, and dancing to old jazz music in the living room. Jackson's house, once silent and pristine, now had socks under the coffee table and crayon art on the fridge. He wouldn't have it any other way. Rachel's health continued to improve. Her treatments shifted from aggressive to maintenance, and her energy returned in waves. She began writing more essays, short stories, even outlines for a memoir. "I want to tell the story," she said one night as they sat together on the porch, wrapped in blankets while snow fell quietly beyond the railing. "Which one?" Jackson asked. She turned to him, her face lit with resolve. "The one where a woman found the courage to raise a daughter alone, and then found her voice again when the man she thought she lost became someone worth finding." Jackson didn't speak. He just kissed her hand. A week later, a small publishing house reached out to Rachel after reading her blog essays. They were interested in developing her writing into a full manuscript. When she told Jackson, his eyes lit with something like awe. "I always knew you had a voice that mattered," he said. "I just needed someone to remind me," she replied. As for Daisy, she flourished. She brought home drawings every week, stories about my family, that included pictures of her mom reading, her dad in an apron, and even Maria, the housekeeper, labeled "our bossy grandma." Jackson had framed one particular drawing in his home office, 3 figures again, this time beneath a banner that said, "Forever Family." It sat on the shelf beside his corporate awards and real estate trophies, and it outshone them all. One evening, as Rachel was cooking pasta, her energy finally strong enough to handle more than stirring, Jackson stood at the stove beside her, attempting to grate cheese without looking like he was breaking a sweat. "You're really trying," she said with amusement. "Trying is half the battle." "No," she replied. "Saying yes was half the battle. The rest is living like you meant it." He set the grater down and turned to her. "I meant it, every word, every step." Rachel leaned in, brushing flour off his chin. "Then I guess it's time we start planning the next step." "The wedding?" he asked, brow raised. "No," she said, smiling wide. "The life after it." That night, after dinner, Daisy stood up on a chair and tapped her fork to a glass like she'd seen in movies. "I have an announcement," she declared. They both turned to her, stifling laughter. "I think you should get married in the backyard, with fairy lights and hot cocoa and maybe marshmallows. Also, I want to throw the flower petals." Jackson put a hand to his heart. "Are you sure you're not the wedding planner?" "I'm the boss," she said proudly. Rachel laughed. "Guess we better follow orders." So they did. Plans were made, but not rushed. A date was chosen for the spring, when the trees would bloom again and the lake would reflect more than just ice and stillness. They wanted it to feel like the life they'd built, honest, intimate, rooted. And on the night Jackson tucked Daisy into bed, she looked at him seriously and asked, "Can I still call you Dad even after the wedding?" Jackson knelt beside her bed, brushing hair from her forehead. "You can call me that for the rest of your life," she smiled. "Okay, just checking." As she drifted off, Jackson sat there a little longer, hand on her back, breath slow and steady. He didn't think about mergers or stock options or schedules. He thought about everything he almost missed and everything he'd never give up again. Spring arrived slowly, like a secret being whispered into the earth. The trees lining the lake unfurled new leaves, delicate and green, while tulips bloomed along the garden beds Jackson never used to notice. The house, once cold and austere, now seemed to breathe. The walls held laughter. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon. Music played softly most mornings, sometimes jazz, sometimes Daisy's favorite playlist, which mostly included off-key children's songs and the occasional Taylor Swift ballad. The backyard had been transformed into something almost magical. Strings of fairy lights hung from the trees like stardust. A small arch, handcrafted by Jackson and painted by Daisy, stood near the lake's edge. On it was written in soft cursive, "Second chances start here." They kept the guest list small, just a few close friends. Maddie cried when she received her invitation, which was handmade by Daisy, complete with glitter that stuck to everything for days. Maria oversaw the baking lemon cake with raspberry filling, Rachel's favorite, and Daisy, in a pale yellow dress, with a crown of fresh wildflowers, carried a basket of petals as if it were the most sacred task in the universe. The ceremony began as the sun started its descent behind the water. Rachel walked barefoot down the grassy aisle. No veil, no orchestra, just the soft hush of the wind and the breath of new beginnings. Jackson waited under the arch, wearing a gray suit that somehow made him look younger, not because of the tailoring, but because of the peace in his eyes. When Rachel reached him, she laughed gently. "You cleaned up well." He took her hands and replied, "You've always looked like my future." There were no elaborate vows, no rehearsed speeches, just words spoken honestly, the kind only two people who had lost each other and found their way back could speak. "I promise to show up," Jackson said, his voice trembling, "even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." "I promise not to run," Rachel whispered, tears glistening in her lashes, "even when fear tells me to. I promise to love Daisy like she's always been mine." She always was. They kissed softly under the arch, surrounded by the hush of love rekindled. As applause rippled through the guests, Daisy ran forward and wrapped her arms around both of them. "Can I say it now?" she asked, eyes wide and shimmering. Jackson laughed. "Go for it." She turned to the crowd, held out her arms, and shouted, "We're a real family now." Everyone laughed, some wiping tears, even Maria. That evening, they ate under the stars. Simple food, paper lanterns, toasts that turned into stories, laughter that spilled into the trees. Daisy convinced Jackson to dance poorly under the lights while Rachel watched, cheeks flushed, eyes bright. At one point, Daisy tugged on Jackson's sleeve. "Do you still have the paper I gave you from the office?" He nodded. "It's framed in my study." "What did it say again?" Jackson knelt to her height. "You asked where you could buy a dad. And you said?" "I said, you didn't need to buy one, because you already had one." She smiled and hugged him tightly. "That's what I thought." As the night wore on, Rachel and Jackson sat on the porch swing, while Daisy fell asleep in Maria's lap inside, her head nestled against a pillow, her fingers still curled around the empty flower basket. The air was still. The lake shimmered in moonlight. Rachel turned toward him. "Do you remember what you said the day you brought us here?" He nodded. "I said, take us home." "And?" Jackson looked out across the yard, where the arch still stood, swaying gently in the wind. "And now, we are." They didn't speak again for a while. They didn't need to. Their silence wasn't empty. It was full of history, healing, and hope. Weeks later, in Jackson's downtown office, a new photo appeared on his desk. Not of buildings or blueprints, but of Daisy in her yellow dress, standing between her mom and dad beneath the fairy-lit arch. Next to it, the framed drawing she made long ago, 3 stick figures under a crooked sun, with a single word scribbled underneath, family. He kept it front and center, right beside his nameplate. Clients noticed. Board members asked about it. But no one got an explanation unless they really wanted the truth. And if they did, Jackson would simply say, "That's where the real story begins." Because for all his success, for all the square footage he'd acquired, for all the handshakes and headlines, Jackson Cole hadn't truly built anything until he built this, his home, his people, his heart. Not out of wealth, not out of duty, but out of love that chose to stay.